check out the Warning Woods merch. The store has shirts and hats in a variety of styles and colors, as well as mugs, phone cases, and more. Thank you for your support.
Phoenix, this is UA-613 en route to DFW requesting emergency landing.
UA-613, we hear you. State your emergency. We'll see what we have.
Thanks, Phoenix. We have an aggressive passenger on board. Both pilots are down.
613, please repeat. Both pilots are down?
Affirmative. Requesting law enforcement and medical to meet us on the ground.
Received, 613. Who am I speaking with right now?
My name is Luther Croft. I'm a passenger.
All right, Mr. Croft. You are clear to land on runway 7. We'll talk you through how to manage the autopilot.
Thanks, Phoenix. I'm a little rusty.
Copy that. We've got you.
Thanks to the expertise of Phoenix Sky Harbor Air Traffic Control, advanced autopilot technology, and the bravery of passengers and flight staff, United Airlines Flight 613 landed safely on February 17, 2024. As soon as the plane stopped, passengers began sliding down its yellow inflatable tongue. Terminal staff escorted them all to safety, while emergency vehicles sped across the tarmac. Paramedics intercepted an injured passenger and the delirious pilot and co-pilot. All three would survive. Airport police boarded single file, guns drawn. The first on board burst into the cockpit. "Are you Luther Croft?" she demanded. The sweaty, wide-eyed man with his hands up nodded vigorously. She asked, "Where's the problem passenger?" "Check in the back," Mr. Croft said. "Hopefully he's still there." UA-613's cabin was, at that point, empty, besides a quiet man sitting way back in row 20, bound in layers of duct tape. He flashed a white grin at the boarding officers, his teeth appearing to glow against his bruised and blood-smeared skin. The officers bunched up, stopping 6 rows in front of the grinning captive. The one in front said, "Sir, we're going to take you into custody. Please just do as we ask and this can go smoothly." The duct-taped man only smiled wider. Flight 613 originally departed from LAX at 1832, estimated to arrive at Dallas-Fort Worth at 2200 hours or 10 p.m. Rhonda was stuck in a middle seat between her 8-year-old daughter and a middle-aged man. You would have judged by the man's tailored suit that he was someone of professional temperament. His head of trimmed white hair, crowned with a reflective bald spot, made him appear harmless and somewhat charming. When Rhonda and her daughter Kylie first arrived at their seats, the businessman had smiled at them both, but he gave Kylie a slow wink that stopped Rhonda from smiling back. The wink belonged in the bygone days of naivete and Shirley Temple, not the modern age of stranger danger. Rhonda sat wordlessly beside the businessman and turned so her back blocked his view of her daughter. "We can't use any electronics until after takeoff, so why don't you take out your book?" she suggested to Kylie. She nodded and reached into her Hello Kitty backpack. "Did you bring something good to read?" the businessman asked. Rhonda turned to him with her hands raised, palms out. "Could we just—" She closed her fingers and mouth, thought for a moment, then said, "My daughter just doesn't do well with strangers." The businessman smiled, a greedy sort of smile, and replied, "We'll be together for the next few hours. That's plenty of time to get to know each other." Rhonda's eyes turned into dark marbles. She said, she would like to read right now. The businessman raised his hands in surrender. "Yes, ma'am." But Rhonda saw future problems winding up behind his eyes. The plane departed without issue. Rhonda would have loved to give Kylie a chance to look down from 30,000 feet, but no part of her wanted to ask the overly friendly businessman to swap seats. At the moment, he was looking out the window, keeping to himself. Rhonda opened her own book and had just begun to read when the man turned back to them. "I can see your house," he said. Rhonda gave him a flash of a smile, the most polite display of irritation. He said, "You have a lovely pool." Rhonda told herself, lots of people in California have pools. It was just a lucky guess. Still glued to the window, the businessman said, "Your neighbors sure love pink, don't they? I can see their umbrellas from all the way up here." Now Kylie looked up from her book to give the man a curious study. "I'm sorry, are you from our neighborhood or something?" Rhonda asked. "I'm from around," said the man. "Not many know me, but I know most." He leaned forward to look at Kylie around her mother. Kylie shrunk back. "Do you know me?" he asked. Kylie shook her head vigorously, and Rhonda put a protective arm across her chest. Grinning, the man said, "Oh, you will. I love little children. I wish I could know them all." Rhonda pulled away in disgust, twisting her knees as far from the creep as possible. "Excuse me, ma'am," a different male voice said. Rhonda would not have turned away from the creep if she hadn't detected willing helpfulness in this new voice. She noticed a fit-looking young man looking back at her from 2 rows ahead. He said, "My coach and I were wondering, would you mind switching seats with us?" The slightly older man next to him turned around and smiled without a hint of creepiness. "Sure," Rhonda said flatly, but as she stood, she mouthed, "Thank you," to the young man. As they awkwardly dodged each other in the aisle on the way to their new seats, a few nearby passengers applauded, which appeared to anger the businessman. "Hey, buddy," said the older of the 2 men as he took Rhonda's seat. "I'm Jim Lewis, and this is Vic Taro. Ring a bell?" "I know you both," the businessman growled. "Oh, so you're an MMA fan?" Jim asked. He didn't get an answer. "Well," continued Jim, "I think we can all have a nice, relaxing flight now, don't you?" He looked ahead and saw a timid flight attendant having a hushed conversation with Rhonda. Jim gave the attendant a nod that said, "We've got this." "Your ground game's strong, but you're not much of a striker," the businessman said, meeting Vic Taro's eyes. "You know, how about you leave the coaching to me? Let's just keep to ourselves," Jim asserted. Vic said, "Nah, it's all right. What you got, old man? Tell me what I should do." Jim smirked and leaned back. "You've got that bad wrist," the businessman said. "Everybody knows that," Vic laughed. "I injured it when I was a little kid." "Yes," said the man. "You told the doctor you fell off your bike, but it was your daddy, wasn't it? A little rough, wasn't he?" Vic's jaw clenched. Tiny muscles pulsed in his cheeks. Jim started to say, "Hey, what the... But that old injury isn't really what slows your fists, is it?" the businessman asked. "Whenever you throw a punch, you picture your father's fists flying at her, your mother." Vic made to stand, but Jim held him down. The timid flight attendant heard and saw it all. How do I know? Well, because he was me. I've tracked down quite a few people who were on board that day to get their perspectives, but I witnessed much of what happened firsthand. I also got a hold of the police interview tapes. Some of what I'm about to share is going to seem pretty unbelievable, I know, but you weren't there. You didn't see, hear, and smell the fear and panic that took over Flight 613 that day. "So, what was your obsession with the fighter, Vic Taro?" Detective Lockwood asked Arthur Kinsley. That turned out to be the businessman's name. "I have no quarrel with him," Arthur said. Lockwood asked, "No? One of the flight attendants said you two had some words and that you were the instigator. You were talking about his childhood, alleging abuse. What was that all about?" "He's sensitive for a fighter, don't you think?" Arthur asked. Lockwood answered, "He's at the hospital with his coach. I haven't had the pleasure of speaking with him just yet." Arthur licked a fleck of blood on his lip. Lockwood tried not to let his disgust show. He really tried. Arthur grinned. And just how is the coach? He'll live. And what of the holy man, the washed-out jarhead? I liked that guy. Such vigor, such surety. A man like that is fun to break. Forcing patience, Lockwood asked, "Why were you flying to Dallas?" Arthur said, "I live by the rules of chaos and discord, which is to say, there are no rules. There are no reasons. Does that frustrate you, Detective? Your position won't let you accept that, I know, but it's true." Arthur's eyes rolled back as his smirk widened into a foul grin. With barely any space between words, he whispered, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Lockwood unconsciously slid backward in his chair as Arthur threw back his head and laughed. Vic had retreated to the lavatory to calm down, leaving Jim alone in row 20 with the weird man you now know as Arthur Kinsley. A few nearby passengers who had heard the prior exchange, including Rhonda and Kylie, shot occasional curious glances their way, but no one made any attempt to interact. Jim decided to leave Mr. Kinsley alone too, that is, until Arthur attempted to stand. Jim barred the row with his arm. Arthur paused and stared at it. "Care to move this out of my way, Coach?" he asked. "Where are you trying to go?" Jim asked. I, firmly, albeit nervously, said to Jim, "Sir, please don't disrupt other passengers." Then I gave a rehearsed look to my fellow flight attendant near the front of the plane. She asked me not to name her. She nodded and disappeared into the galley. "Just need to hit the head," Arthur said, finding his friendly grin again. Jim looked over his shoulder, searching for Vic. He guessed his fighter needed more time to calm down. There was no way Arthur could have known about Vic's private history, his childhood. None of that was public knowledge, and Jim was one of the very few who Vic had ever opened up to about it. "I think it'd be good for you to wait until Vic's back," Jim said. "He needs some space, and when he comes back, I'd ask you not to talk to him anymore." "Apologies," Arthur seethed, sounding anything but sorry. "It's just not every day you meet a world-famous fighter. But I really do need to take a leak." Jim shook his head and left his arm in Arthur's way. Arthur said, "Have it your way then," and his hands went to his belt. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jim asked, sending a nervous glance to me, but I was assisting someone else. With what, I don't remember. "I'm bursting," Arthur said, his fingers tugging at his fly. Jim jerked away and shouted at me then. I looked up just as Arthur launched himself from his seat. He impacted the coach, painfully pressing him down onto the armrest, but that pain was nothing compared to the fiery agony that seared the right side of Jim's head. He felt it, but had no idea what it was. There was a splatter of blood and saliva. Then me and everyone else nearby saw what Arthur had done. Jim felt warmth pouring down his face as he stared at the lumpy pink thing on the floor. He was wrenched off the seats, but not by Arthur. Myself and a passenger pulled Jim across the aisle, while 2 other passengers tackled Arthur. He growled and screamed like an animal. Jim's hand went to the focal point of his pain, the place on the side of his head. Whoa, don't touch that," I said. Arthur's maniacal voice cut through the clamor, shrieking, "That's what you get! That's what you get! Forces of evil in the heavenly realms, that's what you get!" Lockwood took an aspirin with a plastic cup of water before returning to the interview room. As he sat down, he said, "You bit off the coach's ear. What was that about?" "He didn't need it," Arthur mumbled. "I'm sorry?" Making strangling eye contact, Arthur repeated, "He didn't need it. He wasn't listening." "Mr. Kinsley, you're aware that was a serious assault, aren't you? I mean, what you did to Jim Lewis could land you in prison for a long time. They might be able to save the ear if they..." "Ha!" Arthur roared, making Lockwood jump so badly he blushed with anger, then embarrassment. "There'll be nothing left of that ear when it thaws, mark my words. He'll not be wearing it ever again." "Oh? What makes you so sure?" Lockwood leaned back with sardonic curiosity. "Because, detective, my bite does more than bleed you. If I leaned across and kissed you on the lips right now, your mouth would rot away until your teeth rattled all over this table. My saliva is the foam of decay, the bile of depravity, "You've lost me," Lockwood stated calmly. "Need it made clearer than that, do you?" Arthur asked, grinning and twisting his head to the left. "So much for the great detective, yeah? That why they stuck you in the airport searching children's backpacks? Look, one thing I get stuck doing here a lot is talking to crazies like you. You don't intimidate me," Lockwood said, sliding a sweaty palm across his uniform pants. "So, if you won't explain why you bit Mr. Lewis, let's talk about the preacher." "Ah, yes," Arthur wistfully recalled. "The minister." I brought 2 rolls of duct tape from the galley and handed them to one of the passengers helping restrain Arthur Kinsley. He strapped Arthur across the chest, then passed the roll across to whoever was in the best position to wrap it. Eventually, the crowd had Arthur taped to his seat with his arms pinned to his sides. Vic Taro had returned from the lavatory. He took the roll of tape and ripped a piece which he intended to strap across Arthur's mouth, but a voice stopped him. "Wait, I want to talk to him first." Irritated, Vic turned to face a wiry, well-tanned man who looked like the type who regularly runs triathlons. He was wearing a skin-tight polyester shirt and very short shorts, and styled his hair to a dull point in the front. "I thought I recognized what he said earlier about evil in the heavenly realms," the man said. "It's from Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12. Vic asked, "Is that the Bible?" The newcomer put his knees in the empty seat in front of Arthur and leaned forward, studying the captive carefully. Arthur fell into uncharacteristic silence. "I'm Luther Croft. I'm a minister in Dallas, and yes, that is the Bible. Ephesians 6:12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Whether or not it was on purpose, I think this man was telling us something. Arthur's mouth contorted into a grin, or a smile. You know the sort of look. It was a taunting expression, a confident invitation for the minister to share his ludicrous suspicion. Luther turned around to face the crowded plane. "If any of you are prayer people," he said, "I suggest you pray now for this plane and for everyone on board." Murmuring and stifled laughter answered him, and Luther grimaced. He faced Arthur again, wanting now to cover his hideous smile with the duct tape. Arthur said, "I don't think they're scared enough, Minister. Perhaps I can help them understand our little secret." He tipped his head slightly to the left, and the cabin lights on that side flickered out. Shouts of surprise echoed all the way to the front of the plane. Passengers stood instinctively as if to run, then realized there was nowhere to go and just stayed in place, panicking. My fellow flight attendant ran toward the flight deck to inform the pilot, I assumed. On the dark side of the plane, a baby began to cry. Arthur's expression turned from one of glee to solemn content. He returned his attention to Luther and asked, "Would you like to continue this exercise, Minister? Perhaps next I'll cut the air systems, or maybe an engine." Luther searched for his next words carefully. He found himself tempted to test the threat, but he heard a glimpse of the baby's mother softly cooing. This simple moment forced Luther to consider the potential consequences of pushing things too far, rather than interact further with the captive he suspected of demonic possession, a phenomenon he had not fully believed in until then. He began to pray. "Dear Lord, please protect this plane and its passengers. Help us to land safely and..." Arthur cut in with, "And forgive this man for the souls he's fed to Satan's hungry maw. Num num num, tasty terrorist treats for the Dark Lord." Arthur looked genuinely shocked. His confidence shattered. He resumed his prayer, his voice slightly higher and wavering. "May you keep us safe and let us not be led astray by the words of—" Arthur interrupted again, this time singing, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for I'm not an Arab soul." "Enough!" Luther shouted. He looked for a moment like he might strike the duct-taped man, and Vic Taro pushed a couple of bystanders back to give him room to swing. But Luther regained his composure, much to the apparent chagrin of the captive. Arthur's eyes dulled and his lips tightened. Across the cabin, on the dark side, 2 passengers were helping control Jim Lewis's bleeding with gauze and rags I brought out of the galley. I know, it must seem like I was jumping all over the place. In memory, it feels like I was. Trying to insert all of the little things I said or did in the midst of all the chaos is impossible without drawing attention away from the real story. I just don't want you thinking I was standing around with my hands in my pockets the whole time. Right around then, the overhead speakers dinged and quieted the crowd. Finally, the pilot addressed us all.
Folks, as I'm sure you're all aware, we have an emergency situation on board. We'll be landing in Phoenix before continuing to DFW. Thanks for your patience.
"Aw, now you did it. I'm going to miss my sister's rehearsal dinner," someone yelled at Arthur. He curled his lips, exposing teeth, then looked up at the row of lights above his head. They instantly went dark like the others. Pandemonium erupted as if the crowd had been primed to explode. I suppose they had. We attendants tried to shout over all the anxious voices, but no one could hear a word we said. Luther prayed silently while Vic protected Arthur from the mob, a noble act for which Luther greatly respected him. The seatbelt signs started flashing and dinging. A few passengers obeyed, but they were the minority. "The flock is in disarray, Minister," Arthur hissed. "Perhaps a good shepherd could get them in line." Luther made to stand, but Vic pointed a calloused finger at him and said, "Nah, you keep praying, preacher man. I got this." He stood on the seat next to Luther's. "Everybody sit down. This sucks, but let's not make it worse than it is." "What's going on with the lights?" a woman yelled. No one listened to Vic. Luther wondered how far they were from Phoenix and prayed they would be able to land very soon. The other passengers had no idea just how much danger they were really in. "They're still not listening," Arthur chided. "Allow me." The entire plane jerked, causing some to scream and others to choke on silence. A rumbling vibrated the floor and made Luther's ears pop. There came another jolt, accompanied by a slight bank to the right. The pilot came on the intercom, saying with obviously fake composure,
Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a little bit of...
Before the intercom shut off, everyone heard a second voice cry,
Giannis!
Then the plane dipped. The sound of the engines rose in pitch until it was a deafening scream. Only the poor baby's cries were louder. Though it probably only lasted 3 or 4 seconds, the sudden descent felt so long Luther fully expected the plane to collide with the earth. But the plane's nose finally pitched up, and the noise pitched down. "What did you do?" Luther demanded of Arthur, the grinning demon. Renewed screaming came from the front of the cabin, and Luther turned around. The pilot had emerged from the cockpit, stumbling with one hand raised, grasping at nothing, and the other covering his eyes. Something dark was leaking from beneath that hand. Even without the cabin lights on, Luther knew it was blood. Arthur laughed. Vic finally dealt him a left hook across the jaw. "Help!" screamed the pilot. "The pressure! It's too much!" Arthur was out cold. He began to snore the second his chin hit his duct-taped chest. No one moved against Vic, since anyone who would have cared to was focused on the bleeding pilot and wondering if anyone was still in control of the plane. Besides, those close enough to witness the professional fighter sucker-punching the helpless man, to include myself, were on the fighter's side in this particular case. My fellow flight attendant raised her voice above the clamoring crowd and actually said, "Everyone please remain calm," as the man who was supposed to be landing them safely in Phoenix collapsed behind her. I hate to say it, but she deserved the angry and terrified barking which followed. Leaping over legs and dodging blind hands, Luther sprinted to the cockpit. No one tried to stop him. Luther's worst fear was confirmed when he entered the unlocked cockpit and found the co-pilot slumped over his controls. Thankfully, he was still breathing, and Phoenix was within visual distance. Former Marine Lance Corporal Luther Croft was more accustomed to flying an FA-18, but he knew the general idea behind keeping a plane in the air and, most importantly, landing one. Jim Lewis remained vaguely aware of the goings-on in the cabin, although it was becoming increasingly difficult to see anything with the lights out and so many moving bodies all around him. Those attempting to stop his bleeding had been distracted by the pilot and new concerns that they were about to plummet to a fiery death. Jim searched for Vic. Vic, he thought, was probably the last person on the plane who would succumb to panic. As he searched, he noticed a large, unmoving shadow near the back of the plane. Even with his heartbeat boxing out his severed ear, he was alert enough to know he should not have been able to see the shadow in the purple darkness. Yet somehow, it stood out against the white wall behind row 21. Jim felt as if he were detecting the shape with a sense unavailable to his fully conscious mind. It looked like the sort of thing a fully aware person might dismiss as a trick of the light or blame on paranoia. It loomed in the darkness, seeming to feed it or be fed by it. Whatever the connection, they were one. Unbeknownst to Jim, across the aisle, Arthur was stirring. Vic tensed, ready to deal him another blow if necessary. But when his eyes fluttered open, Arthur looked at him with a bizarre expression of both recognition and utter confusion. Vic Taro? He muttered. Where am I? I just knocked you out cold, man. You ready to behave? Vic replied. Wholly innocent, Arthur asked. Knocked me out? But why? Then he noticed the duct tape and the utter darkness beyond the few faces closest to him. The only light came from a few dusk-lit windows, and his own window was closed. Arthur said, I don't know what's happening. Two things happened at once, but only one person observed each. The shadow on the back of the wall disappeared, and Arthur Kinsley vanished. His body was still there, taped to the seat, but the pathetic helplessness which represented his soul vanished as his eyes rolled back. When his pupils reappeared, something else was looking through them. Something that made the battle-scarred cage fighter recoil in terror. Up in the cockpit, Luther was keeping an eye on the autopilot system while searching for the radio. When he found it, he hurriedly called out, Phoenix, this is UA 613 en route to DFW requesting emergency landing. So that was it, huh? Asked Lockwood. You just waited for the plane to land like everyone else after all the trouble you caused? Well, yes, why not? Asked Arthur. Weren't you upset that the plane was landing specifically so we could arrest you? Something you learn when you've been around as long as I have, said Arthur, is to adapt. Sometimes a change of plans can open new doors, better opportunities. Lockwood said, That's an awfully cheery outlook for a guy who's going to be locked up for a good bit. Arthur said, Oh? As if this were breaking news to him, but Lockwood saw the sarcasm in his dimples. That's right, he said. Then he called, Officer? The door latch clunked and the door opened. The officer who had apprehended Arthur when he had been duct-taped to his plane seat stepped in. Lockwood said, Hey, Laramie, go ahead and take Mr. Kinsley to holding. Copy that, Officer Laramie said. As soon as he approached, Arthur angled himself and shot backward in order to grab the officer's gun. Thanks to his retention holster, Laramie's gun stayed put, but he could not wrestle Arthur's fingers away, and his less protected taser was only inches away from the gun. "Grab him!" Laramie shouted. Lockwood lunged forward and caught Arthur's arm. Arthur tried to bite him, and Lockwood jumped back, unholstering his own gun. "Let go!" he yelled. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall as more units approached. Lockwood pulled the slack from his trigger. He shouted, "I don't want to shoot, but I will." "I can't get him off," Laramie grunted. He pounded at Arthur's fingers, and Arthur began to laugh. "Almost there," he chuckled. Then, "Oh?" He pushed just right on the clasp, and Laramie's gun popped loose. Lockwood did not hesitate. Before the sound of his single shot finished ringing in the tiny concrete room, Arthur Kinsley was dead. Oh, okay, Laramie stammered. He slowly moved toward Lockwood, who was stoned with shock. He reached out one hand in a friendly, "come with me" gesture. "Let's get you back a bit, all right?" Laramie said. "It's gonna be fine, okay? I got you. You saved us both." Lockwood heard him, but didn't at the same time. It wasn't taking Arthur's life that had put him in such a state. It was something he couldn't quite explain. A feeling. Something near the back of his neck. He complied as Laramie ushered him out of the blood-splattered room, but as he passed through the door, he thought for a moment Arthur had moved. He couldn't see his body, not behind the metal table, but he could have sworn he saw a shadow move across the wall. He decided, in the end, it was only a trick of the light.
If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. You will get a new story every week if you do. If you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.